It's up to us to carve out the path towards this psychological well-being, or the peak of psychological well-being. And again, I think I know the answers, but I just want to hear you. So what? Why? Why is that? Why do we need to do that?
Right. A few different answers. So I'll kind of go in, there's three realms that I lay out, right? One of them is cognitive, one's emotional, and one's behavioral, right? So, I mean, from just looking at a sociological standpoint, I think one of our biggest, if not the single biggest threat to us as a species and risk to us as a society is the fact that we are these biased, essentially Pleistocene beings, and we're trying to operate with such massive complexity and power, so much knowledge, so much technology, right? It's threatening society in a way that it couldn't have before, right? So that's just the very first answer, is that collectively it's not sustainable for us to keep operating with these biased minds. We have to work to overcome it in ourselves, and often the solutions that you hear are sort of external solutions, right? But I think each individual needs to sort of develop this interest in turning themselves into this clearer thinker. In the emotional realm, right, of course we all want to be happier, right? And it really is a lot of low-hanging fruit that can allow you to become happier by changing these emotions and getting closer to equanimity and peace, right? And then behaviorally, and really this kind of sums up all of them, is that we want to get closer to our ideal selves, right? I happen to think that the closer or further away that we are from our ideal selves is essentially the degree of deep well-being that we'll realize. Mm-hmm. So, when you take a step to get closer to that person that you really would like to be, that embodies all of your highest values, right? I think that is essentially what really regulates your happiness and what makes you happier, as opposed to, the kind of external achievements and possessions that most people sort of think bring happiness, and then they're surprised when it doesn't, right? So really all of the things that we value can be gotten closer to by making modifications to our own minds, right? So in that sense, there's every reason to do this, because everything that you could possibly care about can be achieved and embodied and sort of resembled through your own efforts to change your own systemic patterns. I'm interested in developing cognitive self-mastery, which I call wisdom, right? It's essentially the ability to both think rationally about what's true and what's a good strategy to achieving it, but also having insight into your own mind and knowing what really results in your own satisfaction versus what results in just very, very temporary pleasure. But it's also about having emotional self-mastery. So someone with a high degree of wisdom could still not have any control over their emotions and lash out. And essentially, this is what I see in people who have been hurt and who have suffered and who have no other option, because they don't know how to manage their emotions, than to go and lash out and take it out on generally totally innocent people. And then you have behavioral self-mastery, right? You have people who might be emotionally stable. They might have a clear view of the world in theory, but they end up, acting out in negative ways. They don't have control over their own actions. So when you combine all three of these types of self-mastery together, I think what you end up with is a person who will look like a saint from a moral perspective, but they don't necessarily have to be using this outdated view. They can be simply asking, what is the best decision for me in my life? What will help my long-term goals and will help serve the things that I care about? And I don't want to imply that it's purely self-interested as opposed to altruistic, because I think those can be sort of two sides of the same coin, right? What you care about is what you care about, and it probably extends beyond you. It probably extends to your family. It probably extends to different causes and humanity overall. So ultimately, if you're asking these questions of how can I best achieve what matters to me. I think that represents self-mastery and wisdom.
How do you walk people through the process of restructuring that embedded code that they already have there when it's such a tight grip on them as it is?
Right. So I think I'll kind of go into this triad that I introduce in the book between cognitive and emotional and behavioral algorithms. Right. It's definitely true that these things are deeply ingrained in us. So it's not going to be easy, or in most cases, it's not going to be easy to make these kind of optimizations. I think there's a different solution to every individual case-by-case issue, right? So in the cognitive realm, what you're trying to do is to see reality as clearly as possible. And you've got these biases, some of which exist simply because we weren't made to perceive reality clearly. Others which may actually exist to keep us from seeing reality, right? Because it might not be good for doing the things like surviving and reproducing that we're supposed to do. So in that case, you have to engage in debiasing most of the time. So you're trying to identify which biases are present in your mind, which by default you should assume that there's tons of them that you aren't aware of. And then there are processes that have proven effective for getting rid of them. Right? It's kind of limited, the research that's been done on actually removing biases, and a lot of it is kind of mixed and inconclusive. But what gives me a lot of optimism about it is actually when you look at the emotional effects of different biases and you look at cognitive behavioral therapy specifically. That's been a major influence for a lot of these ideas. And it really, you may be aware, it has its roots in Stoicism, essentially. CBT, was created by essentially two people who were influenced by Stoicism, and it's proven to be the most effective therapeutic method ever developed. And I think, a lot of what it does is it actually has you restructure the cognitive biases that are causing these negative emotions, that are causing you not to see clearly, and not seeing clearly is what's causing you to experience these emotional problems. So in that case, it's really the most straightforward how you actually go about redesigning it, because there is a therapeutic process in place called cognitive restructuring, which actually has you go through a number of steps to eliminate your negative emotions by eliminating the distorted thoughts that are triggering them. And I can get more into any of that, but the behavioral realm is the one that we're actually the most familiar with people talking about making changes in, because we're changing our habits there. And there's a lot of talk about habit change and a lot of books that are hot right now talking about changing habits. So there's a lot of good proven stuff on changing behaviors as well.
Perhaps for some people, there might be some confusion on what self-mastery really means. So how do you define that?
Yeah, so self-mastery is the ability to understand and control your own beliefs, your own emotions, your own behaviors. It's, kind of a more comprehensive version of self-control. Someone with more self-control is able to deliberately decide which actions they want to take and be able to follow through with those. And this applies also to the development of wisdom, to understanding yourself, knowing how your own mind works, and being able to control and change emotional experiences. Now, when you look really closely at these traits, what you find is a collection of interconnected psychological habits, right? I call them psychological algorithms because that's kind of what's happening. Our mind is taking in inputs and producing outputs based on a collection of habits or software, essentially. And so I started making these connections and looking at a lot of things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which basically says that your emotions are the product of your thoughts and beliefs, first and foremost. So when things happen to you, right, it's not just that something bad happened to you and your emotions respond accordingly. So something happens to you, you interpret it negatively, you form a negative belief about it, and that produces a negative emotion. And so understanding how these different nodes connect together, understanding how the mood you're in affects your behaviors and your bad habits, right? Understanding how all these different points sort of interconnect, and going in and saying, what are the leverage points? How can we change this? And I take a very sort of analytical approach to it. I know a lot of self-help is very inspiring and a little bit vague, and kind of you're not quite sure what you're supposed to do. And I like going into specific mental mechanisms like anxiety, for example, and saying, how can we master anxiety? Not just like keep managing it. How can we actually get to where we don't experience unwanted anxiety anymore? And I found that when you study it that closely, you really do find the leverage points for creating those changes and permanently getting rid of these sort of things that most people assume have to plague your mind for your whole life.
So that is very interesting. What are the aspects that we can apply then? I mean, anxiety seems something so far away from systems. So what are the other aspects in life that we can, where we can exploit self-mastery?
Absolutely. Self-mastery affects pretty much every area of your life. In the workplace, for example, there are tons of emotions that can affect you and can cause you to make bad decisions, make poor evaluations and judgments, and act in a way that you're not proud of later. So the more self-mastery you have in that kind of area, the more likely you're going to be to succeed in your work, your career. Relationships, I think self-mastery is huge and really an underestimated component of healthy relationships. I mean, there are a lot of people who think that, you know, it's all about communication and saying whatever it is you're thinking at any given time. And I tend to find that healthier relationships very often are about controlling yourself, not saying what you're thinking when you're in that certain mood state, right? Being able to exert control over yourself and say, no, I'm not going to act in a way that I wouldn't be proud of later, or say something I don't mean. And a big part of, relationships, work, everything essentially is enhanced if you can develop greater mastery over yourself. But it's also kind of a direct route to happiness too. I mean, a lot of the things that we have in our lives, our work, our relationships, our accomplishments and possessions, these are sort of an indirect mean to happiness. We get these things because we want them to produce happiness in us, but we can also go directly into our own minds and make changes that will bring a direct kind of happiness that we don't need something outside of us in order to unlock. So we really have every reason to be pursuing self-mastery, but I think we have a tendency to underestimate it. I don't think we're really biologically wired to pay attention to this kind of thing as much as the shiny objects we see around us. And so it takes a certain kind of rebellion against our own biological wiring to say, no, I'm going to put self-mastery before everything else. I'm going to optimize my mind for well-being first and foremost, and then everything else is secondary after that.
What would you say are the most common challenges that people face when they are going through that path?
Very good question. I think I think it can be easy to want progress to happen a lot faster than it does. I think it can be easy to try something for a day and say that didn't work and then give up on it. The fact is we have a lot of exercises. I mean, all my programs are like 30-day, 30 exercises. And you know, a lot of people start, and the ones who finish those 30-day programs, you know, end up saying this was truly life-changing. But a lot of people give up in that first week and don't ever get to a point where it pays off. So I think that's one of the big ones. I also think, you know, we talk a lot about mindfulness today, and in general, metacognitive awareness is kind of the same as mindfulness, is really a necessary prerequisite step for these changes. A lot of people who would like to make changes to their minds, they really don't know what's going on in their minds at any given time. They don't have a lot of clarity into what thoughts they're having, what feelings are actually going on in there. It's like a black box for them. And so that's when mindfulness becomes really important. So you need a way of stepping back. And I think meditation is one way of doing that. I think a lot of these logging exercises we're talking about, where you're actually trying to notice and write down your thoughts and feelings, it's another great way of doing this. but you need to get to a point where you actually notice and you kind of know what's going on in your head. This will basically get you halfway there. If you can do this, changing what's going on in your head is actually the easy part.